A Song of Ice and Fire is a story set in a world where prophecy is 100% real and 110% dangerous. But in Daenys the Dreamer, perhaps the most famous prophet in all the history of Westeros, we have a rare example of someone whose prophecies, or one particular prophecy that we know of, was listened to by the people in power, or person in power, her father, and it had a positive effect. Most of the time, it doesn't go quite so well, right? Even if people actually listen to the prophecy in the first place, which they often don't. But beyond that, take Jaehaerys II, for example. Listened to the Ghost of Highheart when it comes to the prince/princess that was promised. Didn't go so well. Arguably, you could say the Targaryen dynasty being saved by Daenys the Dreamer wasn't actually a good thing. But for them, it was. For House Targaryen, it was. It was certainly a benefit to them. And it might have been a good thing for humanity as a whole, because maybe without Daenys the Dreamer, the others might be primed for a big win right now because, well, they would be able to make their plans for Westeros without having to worry about dragons. There have been a lot of Targaryen dreamers, but she stands alone at the top. None of the others are particularly celebrated within their own family, even. We don't see histories written about them. They get mentioned and their dreams are mentioned kind of casually or not at all. I mean, how many times have we theorized about a certain Targaryen dreamer or otherwise, or their dreams? A lot, right? We've done quite a bit of that over the years. There's always a shroud of mystery around it, and often a shroud of shame. Or a lack of willingness to share, right? Like Daeron the Drunkard again. He's not super excited about telling people what his dreams are, and you can see why. Daenys, though, is arguably explicitly the opposite, though, again, there's a lot of mystery, not just about the prophecies here, but about her as a person. We don't really have a clear idea of her, say, personality. But Daenys the Dreamer wasn't just a prophet and a dreamer. That certainly impacts our full picture of her. She was the Lady of Dragonstone, married to the most powerful Targaryen lord of the Century of Blood era. And he was, of course, her brother. They had children, and since their line continued unbroken after them, every Targaryen we know of after them is related to her. They're all her descendants. That, of course, includes Blackfyres and a few others. What about her dragon? What about the rest of her family? What was it like being right about the doom? One of those things where you're like, I hope I'm wrong, but yeah, well, you weren't wrong, were you, Daenys? And what was it like to live in that era after the doom, the thing you were right about that you saw coming more than a decade in advance? What a strange existence that is. It's really hard to fathom that. And how did other Targaryens of that era and later, how do they look upon her? Is she an object of worship, like a sacred figure in their history that without her they wouldn't exist? Well, it's true, they wouldn't. It doesn't mean they look upon her with that sort of gratitude, but I could assume probably some of them would. You just think that feeling would be around there somewhere. That's just a sample of the questions we have. We have a lot of questions about her, and we can't answer them all as usual. There's too many. And so many mysteries. We never have all the answers, but the questions themselves, as always, are often very entertaining, even without answers, right? They lead to other thought-provoking questions about the nature of prophecy, the history of Westeros, Essos and House Targaryen informs A Song of Ice and Fire. There's a lot of related topics here. So we'll compare her to other prophets, especially other dreamers, especially other Targaryens, and to Daenerys, with whom she has many parallels. We also have real-life examples of prophecy in how it works in the real world and how it's been viewed. Lots of other examples like that, lots of other fun stuff. All that and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome back, everybody. We are live here on YouTube at 3 o'clock Eastern. That's what we do with our live streaming. That's how we do our schedule. If you're available on Sundays at 3, you should be checking us out live. Otherwise, catch the video later. You can watch it on Spotify after it's edited, and it's a little cleaner, a little smoother, a little better produced. And the audio-only versions are always available anywhere you catch podcasts, whether it's Spotify, iTunes, whatever. And if you catch us on Patreon, though, you get it without ads. Shout out to our good friend Nina. She had a lot of great takes on this one, as she so often does. Latest blog post over on goodqueenally.tumblr.com, that's with one L in Ally, is somewhat relevant to today by coincidence. The question she got was, Balerion's death somewhat symbolizes Viserys' reign, Viserys I, as the bringing on the dying of the dragons. What about symbolism tied to other crowns and Targaryen deaths over the years? And Nina does have a lot of thoughts about the crowns and what they represent and similar overlapping topics. So check that out if you are so inclined. It's a great post. You can always send us questions during the episode or after, WesteroShistory@gmail.com, or hit us up on any of our socials. And at the end of this episode, I'll hit you with some episodes that relate to this one. Further immersion set up for you. And if you listen on Spotify, you can check these days. In the episode, we are now able to embed links to other episodes. So instead of me just telling you what other episodes there are, there's actually links to those episodes. Now, it's only going to be true for recent episodes. We're going to try to update our past catalog, but that will take a little while.
And that's on Spotify.
Yeah, only on Spotify right now. But of course, our episodes are on every platform. Now, trivia question. At the end, of course, I'll give you the answer to this one. What book did Archmaester Marwyn write? It's actually possible he wrote other books, but we only know of this one. So yeah, that's the question. What book did Archmaester Marwyn write? The answer is in the episode. So if you pay close attention, you'll hear it. Or you might know it already. Here's what we have for you today. Here's the different sections for this episode. We'll start with our first mention, as we so often do. Daenys' dragon, divining the doom, both before and after. Then we have the Century of Blood, Gaemon the Glorious, Aegon and Elena, who are their children, Signs and Portents, that's Daenys' Book of Visions, Possible Prophecies, Why Lost, as in, why is that book lost? Prophetess tropes, we've got some TV tropes work for you. The End is Nigh, Cassandra, one of the most famous prophets of all time in fiction and ancient times. We have our quote of the week. Then we have Death and Legacy for Daenys, and then a brief outro, and that's our episode. Let's get to it with that first mention, shall we? It's slightly debatable which is the first mention of Daenys, so we'll have both quotes for you. Here's the first one. It's from A Feast for Crows. It's Asha speaking to one of the best named characters in all of the series. That's the Reader, aka Roderick the Reader. And he says, right here, quote, "What reading was so urgent that you leave your guests without a host?"
Archmaester Marwyn's Book of Lost Books. He lifted his gaze from the page to study her. Hotho brought me a copy from Old Town. He has a daughter he would have me wed. Lord Roderick tapped the book with a long nail. See here? Marwyn claims to have found 3 pages of signs and portents, visions written down by the maiden daughter of Aenar Targaryen before the doom came to Valyria.
The reason you might argue that this doesn't count as the first mention of Daenys is, well, did he say the word Daenys? He didn't actually say her name, did he? He said maiden daughter of Aenar. But that's who it is. I mean, there's no other maiden daughter of Aenar who wrote signs and portents. So it's like, well, no, both of his daughters wrote signs and portents. It was like a warring. No, of course, there's just the one. So it actually doesn't say here that she predicted the doom. It just says written down by the maiden daughter of Aenar Targaryen before the doom came to Valyria. But that, of course, is clarified very thoroughly later. Now, here's the first time her actual name appears in any of the texts, and it's not A Song of Ice and Fire, but The World of Ice and Fire, which is interesting in and of itself, because as I pointed out in the intro, it's pretty rare for this type of prophecy, or any type of prophecy, to be a matter of historical record. But in this case, it's just too hard to ignore, too big. This is what happened just after the settling of Dragonstone by Valyrian traders over the era that followed. Quote,
2 centuries passed, centuries in which the coveted Valyrian steel began to trickle into the 7 kingdoms more swiftly than before. though not swiftly enough for all the lords and kings who desired it. And although the sight of a dragonlord flying high above Blackwater Bay was not unknown, it occurred more frequently as time passed. Valyria felt its outpost was secured, and the dragonlords thus continued their schemes and intrigues on their native continent. And then, unexpected to all, save, perhaps, Aenar Targaryen and his maiden daughter, Daenys the Dreamer, the doom came to Valyria.
Yeah, that's really important. And as an aside, one day we'll cover Aenar a little more thoroughly. It's interesting to consider the possibility that because the Targaryens lost all their incomes, they certainly had a lot of stored wealth and jewelry and, stuff that they'd collected over the eons. They lost a lot of their income, if not most of their income, when they moved to Dragonstone. So it's entirely possible that the uptick in Valyrian steel was because of the Targaryens selling off some of it because they needed money. Now, as for the first mention aspect of this, it doesn't really matter, does it? This is something we do for fun to introduce the topic. So whichever one counts as the first, I don't care. They're both really good, excellent introductions to the subject. They both belong at the beginning here. And interestingly, both of the quotes refer to her as maiden daughter, which is important. Now, one of the first things to come to mind when you hear young woman with power in a fantasy setting, I mean magical power, not like noble power, not like royal power or political power. You think of what would be classified as the virgin power trope, which is a really common trope in fiction, which is you have powers that you lose if you lose your virginity. There's a lot of these versions of this out there. It's an ancient trope. It's super old. The most common subtrope of this probably is the unicorns prefer virgins trope. This is a really, really old trope. It's traceable to Mahabharata, an Indian epic, which is part of ancient Hindu mythology. There was a war between branches of the Kuru dynasty. You guessed it, that's a royal dynasty that went to war against itself. So, figures, right? It's actually traceable farther than this, but through like iconography, drawn carvings and stuff like that. But in terms of written version, the Mahabharata was the first. So that's crazy. It's super old, like 4th century BC or something like that. But the twist here is that the unicorn is not a person, or is not an animal. It is a person. It translates literally as one horn. And the original myth is about a guy named Askarnga. I don't know how to say it. A name which I absolutely didn't pronounce correctly. He's an ascetic. And in ancient Hindu mythology, ascetics who were ascetics for long enough and mastered it were granted one wish by the gods. And to stop this particular ascetic from becoming a god, the king of the region had him sent his daughter or someone to seduce the ascetic, and then once they slept together, well, you're not an ascetic anymore, are you? You just gave into worldly pleasure. So that's how she stopped him. So there you go. So then he lost his power for that. So there you go. That's the actual like scholarly original source for the unicorns prefer virgins trope, which is part of the virginity and power trope that is really, as I said, very ubiquitous. And I probably didn't need to tell you that. We've all encountered it throughout, our days as readers of fiction and fantasy. So does Daenys belong on that list? We don't think so, but maybe, because there's no indication that she lost her power after losing her virginity, after getting married, right? And that isn't really a thing in A Song of Ice and Fire. We don't have other examples of that. Still, it's odd, isn't it, that these mentions of her are maiden daughter. That is a detail that gets included in multiple times, so we shouldn't just ignore it. That said, it isn't obvious what it means. Did she just... It's also said in that quote that signs and portents was of visions written down before the doom. Well, what about her visions after the doom? Did she stop having visions? That seems unlikely. There's no other Targaryen dreamer we've ever heard that about. Like, they had dreams and then they just stopped? I don't think we have an example like that. Now, of course, there's plenty of Targaryens that could have happened with, and it just wasn't documented. But it's hard for us to rest on that as a likely concept because we have no other examples of it. Did she stop having visions when she went to Westeros? Maybe that was it. Maybe the change of location. Maybe the loss of magic. Valyria collapsing ended a lot of the magic in the world. A lot of the dragons dying out. Maybe just the magical forces were weaker and she wasn't able to attune to them anymore. A lot of answers there. There's some good, solid theories, but we can't be too sure, right? So the virgin power trope is... maybe George is toying with it here, but I don't think he's fully engaging with it because it's just, he doesn't bring it up anywhere else, it doesn't come up elsewhere. But it is odd, right, that he wrote it this way with the phrase maiden daughter, and then there's no follow-up. There's no adult Daenys' visions. Like, we don't know what happened to Signs and Portents. It's a lost book, and that's part of what we'll talk about today. But for all we know, there was a Signs and Portents 2, Electric Boogaloo. But no copies of that ever survived. Signs and Portents 3, Revenge of the Unicorn. She wrote all these books, but they all got destroyed. We never heard about it. No. Yeah, it's true, actually. The Targaryens were going to make that a franchise. That's how they were going to make money in Westeros. The Signs and Portents franchise. But no, it didn't work out for them. Nina has a great take here on this. She says it's less a literal connection between her maidenhood and her prophetic powers and more a thematic one. Daenys, as Aenar's maiden daughter, was likely the least powerful person in her family, in a very powerful family. She's not the son that's going to inherit. She's not a married woman who can exercise power through her husband. It's not some great lord or lady. Yeah, it was a teenager, a preteen girl that was the salvation of the entire family. That's maybe the inversion George is working with here, that it was the least powerful member of the family that saved them all. And I mean them all, right? Not just the current family, but everyone that came after. She saved them all. So that's kind of what Dany is. Dany, in a sense, is the savior of the Targaryen. She's bringing them back. She's the one who brings the dragons back. She's the one that's restoring a lot of what they were. Making them a power again. And she's a teenager. She's young like Daenys was. And the name is similar, right? Daenys, Daenerys, right? I mean, there's a lot of these like Rhaenys, other type parallels, or Daenerys is like kind of like Ares, Dan Ares. It's spelled a little differently, but you can see that. Still, Daenys Daenerys is pretty close. Like, of all the other Targaryen names, Daenys is probably the closest one to Daenerys. Right, that's if I were to like, what's the most similar one? It's that, right? And the other probably works vice versa too.
Can I say the funny thing is every time you try to Google Daenys Targaryen, Google will be like, "Did you mean Daenerys?" I'm like, "No, I didn't.
I didn't. No." That's really funny. Yeah, it's not like there's a Rhaenyra. There is a Rhaenys, which might be. You could argue that's just as close to Daenys, but for Daenerys, there isn't anything else really that close. So I think Nina nails that. It's a really good take. She comes into her power when she's unimportant. Like, everyone had made her an afterthought. Illyrio and Varys were using her as a pawn. She was just a way to get Khal Drogo to be connected to Viserys, to set up their whole bait plan to make Aegon the hero. Yeah, she was nothing to them, but then she rose to be the most important of all. And that's also a strong parallel. And great take, Nina, yeah. So, and with the names and everything, it just really fits. And both of them are taking their families to Westeros, right? Daenerys starts in Essos and wants to migrate west. Daenys does too, for different reasons, but it's to bring the dragons over there. It's to go to Dragonstone. They're going to end up in the same place. Dany went into the fire, the pyre. Daenys fled before the fire, stay away from the doom. So he has a lot of strong parallels here.
And of course, Daenerys goes by Dany.
Yeah, Daenys. Yeah, good point. Yeah, that's really close. And yeah, so this is just rife with parallels here. We wanted to do a little bit of research because I just couldn't remember, like, before 2014, before the World of Ice and Fire, what did we think happened? How did we think the Targaryens survived? What was it? I think we just thought they moved. We might have thought there was some political upheaval, and then they fled from. They came out on the wrong side of a political contest, and they fled so that they wouldn't get wiped out or something like that. And then they later invented this story of a prophecy to like cover. There's like everybody. The Doom blew up Valyria. No one's gonna tell the truest version of our story. No one's going to call out our lies here. No, Daenys had a prophecy. Yeah, sure. One of our daughters from way back when predicted all this. Yeah, that's what happened. Sure. Mm-hmm. No, it probably did happen, but you can see, and we'll touch on that on and off throughout this episode, that maybe some of these details were exaggerated by the Targaryens to make themselves look a little better. I wouldn't go quite so far as to say the whole thing is made up, but that should be considered too. Winners write history, and when everybody who knew the winners is dead, you can't corroborate their story. Nina found that the first time Daenys was name dropped in real life was Worldcon 2012, when he was reading unpublished excerpts from the World of Ice and Fire. And Shay and I attended one of those, not the Worldcon 2012, but we did hear some of those early World of Ice and Fire readings. And
in 2014.
Yeah, we heard one in 2014, was the Lannister one, the first time the Westerlands was read. And I remember that because there was some stuff in there that he changed. Remember, like the hooded the hooded necromancer of Banefort, things like that. That was cool. But didn't all stay. Let's talk about Daenys' dragon. We have every reason to believe she had one. They brought 5 from Valyria to Dragonstone, and she only had the one brother. So who else could have owned these dragons besides her, right? And her one brother, and her mother, maybe, probably, I guess I should say. Now, Aenar had siblings, we're told. He also had multiple wives. So that could have accounted for some of the other dragons, but the children of Aenar would take precedence because they were going to be married. They were going to be Lord and Lady next. So you'd think they'd be first in line for dragons. Now, Gaiman would come before her. He was older and he was the boy. I guess that matters. But either way, they were expected to marry each other and rule together. So let's refresh ourselves on this corner of Targaryen history. Quote,
Vhagar and Meraxes had hatched on Dragonstone. Balerion alone had come to the island with Aenar the Exile and Daenys the Dreamer, the youngest of the 5 dragons they brought with them. The older dragons had died during the intervening years, but Balerion lived on, growing ever larger, fiercer, and more willful. If we discount the tales of certain sorcerers and mountebanks, as we should, he is mayhaps the only living creature in the world that knew Valyria before the Doom.
We can safely ignore Vhagar and Meraxes when considering who Daenys had as a mount, because they were born significantly later. And because Balerion was the youngest of the dragons that Aenar brought over, well, he's the least likely to be ridden by the head of the household. Aenar probably had already had a dragon by the time Balerion was born, and he wouldn't have picked a hatchling anyway. This isn't the egg in the cradle era. That tradition began in Westeros, as far as we know, unless it was a revived tradition. But that was started by Rhaena, as in daughter of Aenys. So, and Alyssa. So that's not likely to be the case here. They didn't do the egg in the cradle thing, so we can't use that as a way of thinking about how things would have gone. So we're used to thinking dragons in terms of how powerful they are versus armies, right? Like an army with a dragon is almost always going to beat one without. But here in the heart of Valyria, you have 39 other families with dragons. It's a different environment. The calculus is a lot different, like what they're considering, what kind of advantages it gives them. It doesn't give them advantages over the other dragonlord families. It gives them perhaps equal footing at best, especially because we know the Targaryens weren't as powerful as those other families. So it really fits that Balerion was Daenys' dragon. Add up all this evidence. The smallest dragon at the time, she probably gets a dragon because she's going to be the Lady of Dragonstone, or the Lady of House Targaryen in Valyria before they decided to move. So she would be in line for an important dragon, but not the biggest one. And since this was the youngest one they had at the time, it just fits really well. There's only 5 dragons. 3 or 4 of them were probably already claimed, blah, blah. There's not a lot of other wiggle room here. It's certainly not a sure thing. But we have long theorized that Balerion was written by Daenys because of that. Gaiman, as the future head of the household, would have probably claimed a larger dragon, a big one that was a full adult rather than one that's only 15 to 20 years old at most, right? So Daenys was probably the youngest that was queued up for a dragon as well. So it just all lines up pretty well. Now, House of the Dragon full on was like, yeah, we're going with that. They had some text that I think we talked about at the time, but y'all may have missed it. On screen, Ashea has this little book that was visible in a scene or two. It's sort of a background material. And we know who wrote this. This was written by T. Mikkel, who is the only person in the world that has the resume of being George R. R. Martin's writing assistant and a writer for House of the Dragon. Nobody in the world has both those credits. No one worked really close with George for years and is a writer on the show. So she has a different level of credibility and knowledge than the vast majority of other writers. No shade on the other writers. I'm just saying she has this leg up in terms of lore. She knows it better than anybody in that writing room. So we were super happy to see this, and I immediately texted her. I was like, T, did you write this stuff? And she said yes. And she told me at the time, she's like, you feel free to share this. This was months ago. We haven't had an occasion to share it until now. But she said jokingly, I would much rather be associated with this than that shrubbery stuff. Which she wrote that too. All that stuff about the singing shrubbery and the Valyrian dragonlord who was really into plants and all that. That was from another book that you could see and translate and all that. Anyway, so shout out to T. She did a great job with this. We're very happy to see.
She also did some song lyrics.
T did write some song lyrics. Yeah, she wrote the Nymeria song. Yeah. That was really good. So she's sure her fingerprints are all over a lot of the stuff. Her name's in the credits, of course, for House of the Dragon. And she went a little farther with this. What she did was she had Daenys claim Balerion the night before she jumped to the Doom. So she claims Balerion, who is listed to be only about the size of a horse at that time. And that very night, she dreams of the Doom. That was pretty cool. And they also invented a mother for Gaiman and Daenys. So that would be Aenar's wife, because we don't know her name. And T named her Elena, which makes a lot of sense, because Elaine is also one of the daughters of Daenys and Gaiman. So it kind of makes sense that they would name one of their daughters after their mother. It's also a recurring Targaryen name, so it just fits. More on her later, because T fleshed out a bit of her personality in ways that I think is a good template for us to consider how a lot of the Targaryens felt about living in Dragonstone after having moved away from Valyria. So more on that later. Lady Sophia Velaryon sends a super chat, says, hello from the DMV area. Have a great holiday weekend. You as well, Lady Sophia Velaryon. Glad we could be doing a topic here that relates to your household indirectly. And to the rest of you out there as well, have a great holiday weekend. We hope you're doing well. Hope you're safe and happy, enjoying this podcast in a good place. Divining the Doom. We've said plenty of times that there's basically no way Aenar would have listened to his maiden daughter about such a big prophecy, such a thing that would cause them to move to another continent, if she hadn't proven herself with other prophecies first. Like, there's no way this was the first thing they gambled on. Like, well, looks like our daughter's a dreamer. She hasn't proven it yet. We haven't had a single one of her prophecies come true, but let's uproot our entire family and move to Westeros because of this, right? That doesn't make any sense, does it? It's either, it could be the thing we said before, that they made it all up to justify like fleeing from some political thing they lost. You know, they were in danger, and then they made up this prophecy stuff later. There's enough evidence to suggest that it probably really did happen. But again, I like entertaining these deconstructions of legends and looking at how the winners would exaggerate their past to make themselves look better. It's also kind of hard to imagine, though, she was the only one, right? There's lots of prophecy. There's lots of magic to predict the future in this world. And Valyria was extremely steeped in sorcery, right? And they were very open, Valyria was, as a freehold, to a variety of religions, many of which had their own versions of prophecy, like the Red Priests. So do we, I suppose, believe that a lot of them saw it, but they didn't believe it, they didn't understand it, or they weren't willing to move to another continent to avoid it. They just couldn't get themselves to accept it. Maybe there was a lot of denial going on. I tend to believe that some other people moved, some others left, but not on a scale that would have been noticed historically. Like some small sect, some small cult leaves, this other group with his followers, maybe some popular street prophet that they're listening to him. So they leave too, because they hear that he is having dreams of this violent destruction of the entire continent or of the city or however the dreams manifest. It's just kind of hard to believe that Daenys was the only one, right? Like that's pretty tough. It's also, if you want to get really deep into theory, there's always the idea that the Werewood network is responsible. We'd be like, what? How is that possible, Aziz? Well, if the Werewood network is preparing itself for a distant, long-term future battle against the others, and they know they're going to need the power of dragons for that, well, they need to prepare for that. It's like, well, if they can foresee the doom, they got to go, well, we need at least one of these dragonlord families to leave that place so that their dragons survive, so that 100, 200, 300, 400, however many years from now, those dragons can help us defeat the others. Now, of course, the dragons died out anyway and then came back. But if those eggs and dragons hadn't been rescued from Valyria before the doom, then I don't even think that the dragons could have come back later, because even the eggs would have all been destroyed, probably. There might not have even been clutches left. So it's a thin theory. It's very out there. But it's worth mentioning that, if you've got people that can see the future and they know they're going to need dragons, well, then they would take steps to... That would explain why only one person or one family had these dreams that they listened to, because they were targeted. The Werewood net's like, let's target this young girl, give her these dreams, make them real, make her believe them, do it in a way that her father is convinced because she's been right about other things. See, when you stack it all up, it does kind of become a little far-fetched, but... it's possible. Nina adds that, it's possible that people, for the most part, saw what they wanted to see when they're looking for visions of the future. Think of Melisandre. Melisandre just basically just fills in the blanks, like, yeah, it's probably right, and then tells people it's right, like she did with Eastwatch. When she's envisioning the girl in gray on a dying horse, she's like, yeah, gotta be Arya. She just... jumps to a lot of conclusions there. It's a great example, a classic example of someone seeing what they want and then being confident without deserving it, right? Like it's unearned confidence, but Melisandre is a very confident person. She delivers these things with charisma and puts them in a way that makes you believe them, right? She's really convincing. So that we could have a lot of that going on. People don't want to go out there and say everybody's gonna die. Like, you sound like a crazy street preacher. Like the doom is coming. Like we've all probably seen a dude, or it's usually a dude, but a person on the street corner going, the end is nigh, repent. Like, nobody listens to that guy. That's probably true in ancient times too. Like, who's going to listen to that? No one wants to hear that, even if it's true. Yeah, we're all, as a species, we're good at denial, especially on a mass level. So yeah, it's also, Nina also adds, these Valyrian freeholders, they've been doing what they've been doing for thousands of years. They probably just don't believe it. They're just maybe a little arrogant. They're like, nah, we got this. We're so powerful. We've got sorceress energy. We can control these volcanoes. We rule the world, yo. We're not worried about this. So yeah, arrogance paired with denial. And Yandel, of all people, does allude to the faith of R'hllor possibly being responsible or partly responsible. He says that others speak of the priests of R'hllor calling down the fire of their god in queer rituals. Probably not, but it goes to show how people just make these connections because they don't have answers, and not having answers is an unsatisfactory place to land for a lot of people. A lot of us are very uncomfortable not landing on something. We have to have reasons, even if they aren't supported by evidence. We hate mysteries. Not everybody, but that's a common thing for people. It's like, we got to have an answer here. Give me an answer so I can at least think about something else. So did the Red Priest see the Dragon Lords as favored by R'hllor? Or, yeah, this is a whole nother subtopic here, but it's interesting to consider, like, how do dragons figure into the whole R'hllorism angle? It's not exactly explained to this point. Or was it the other way around? Is it the doom was divine punishment by R'hllor? Like, this is the ultimate power of fire being unleashed on a civilization. Well, they weren't R'hllor worshippers. You could easily see why they deserve to be destroyed. They do all this manipulation of fire and all that, and they don't give due to R'hllor, the god of all that. Like, that's blasphemous. You know, they should be thankful. And we should give Aenar a little credit here, probably. Going against the grain would have been difficult. We saw how his family became a laughingstock, which is, by the way, part of why the theory that this was made up to cover up some embarrassing political failure has a little bit of legs as an idea. But again, I think this was something he had proof of. His daughter had been right about several things. She was already writing a book, Signs and Portents, as a child. So this isn't faith. This is evidence-based, I think. But there might have been a little faith mixed in there, too. But mostly, I think it's evidence-based. So, but there wasn't a lot of time for this. Like, how much could she have proven if she was a child? Like, how many possible... There's no long term when you're, 12 or 10 or something like that? How many prophecies could she possibly have been right about over just a decade or less? Like, she's not delivering prophecies when she's 2. She can't even speak yet. So... maybe she's 4 and she starts delivering prophecies. That's kind of stretching it, right? What a creepy kid, you know, like, what is she, Alia from Dune, the just speaking like an adult the minute she pops out of the womb? Like, I don't think so. And she would go on to marry her brother, so, you know, maiden daughter couldn't have lasted that long. They probably got married relatively early in life because, well, it was a foregone conclusion that they would, and it's not like there were a lot of them. They need to breed to keep the family alive. It's also possible that Aenar may have been more ready to accept the idea of voluntary exile if he knew it was going to happen. If he felt confident that his daughter was right, and they're all laughing at him, he's like, I can take the laughter, I can take the shame and the shunning, because they're all going to explode. And then who's going to have the last laugh? I'm going to have to be patient about it. It might suck. It might suck for a long time, and it would be 12 years, so it was a long time. We're not 100% sure Aenar even lasted all the 12 of those years. But if he did, it would have been maybe bittersweet. He's like, yeah, I'm not happy that Valyria exploded, but those jerks that laughed at me and I showed them, you know, really don't know what was in his mind at that point. But, you know, I could see how it would all be very distracting to when the tidal waves showed up. It was like, oh, what's that smoke in the distance? Did it really happen? Oh my God, the doom happened? Holy crap. Well, they wouldn't have called it the doom yet, but that's when they would have maybe started kicking around names for it. So none of this undermines the point of Daenys being a seer. But, you know, because we know a lot of Valyrian houses employed like sorcerer princes, and they controlled the flames of the 14 volcanoes and all that. So there's a lot of magic already implied here. So, yeah, the willingness to believe is somewhat preloaded here. But I think what's even more interesting is how much the Targaryens rely on prophecy after this. And you can see why. They're only alive today because their ancestor Aenar listened to Daenys in the first place. So that's going to tilt you as a whole, as a family unit, towards believing in prophecies, given one saved your whole family from exploding. Poofball sends a super chat, says, yay, made it. Glad y'all guys are still going. Yeah, I'm glad you made it too, Poofball. We always appreciate when y'all show up live. It's great when y'all consume our content, you know, anytime, whether you watch it afterwards or during or before. It's all great for us. We love that. But when you come live and hang out and chat with the other commenters and join the community like that, it's special for us, so we appreciate that. Let's talk about before. The span of time just before the doom, let's say after the prophecy was delivered, but before it actually happened, before they actually moved, after they moved, but before the doom actually happened. Here is a brief quote.
12 years before the doom of Valyria, 114 BC, Aenar Targaryen sold his holdings in the freehold and the lands of the long summer, and moved with all his wives, wealth, slaves, dragons, siblings, kin, and children to Dragonstone, a bleak island citadel beneath a smoking mountain in the narrow sea. Really sounds like the setup to a sitcom.
It is. In fact, we've got more tropes for you here. Given this topic is low on direct detail, we're able to play with some of the vagueness in our own way, which is its own kind of fun. But just before that, let me set it up a little. This is a simple statement, right? He moved everybody, but that list: wives, wealth, slaves, dragons, siblings, kin, and children. There's a lot of people implied there, but we don't hear about any of them, really, except for the children and the dragons. The other kin, the cousins, like, who are these people? Is this House Coharis and House Baratheon, right? Is this who we're talking about? Probably, like, lesser lordlings, kind of the equivalent of a House Cassel or a House Poole, houses that don't have land but are deeply entwined with House Stark and have been holding, hereditary titles like Master at Arms or household steward for generations. So the Targaryens probably had things like that. We don't know who those houses are necessarily, but yes, Coharis would have been one of them, and Baratheon another one. But yeah, who are these other people? What happened to the other siblings and the kin? And we don't really know. But it's something that maybe gets developed a little bit later. So the word bleak is important here. Really important, right? The bleak island citadel beneath a smoking mountain in the narrow sea. Imagine living at the heart of the most powerful civilization ever known, wielding immense wealth and control for eons, and then leaving to live in a bleak island citadel. And yeah, if the story of this flight in their early years at Dragonstone were written, if this was like a separate story or a TV show being made, it would absolutely be the fish out of water trope, or the from New York to nowhere trope. It's like Schitt's Creek. You all know the show Schitt's Creek. It's a family that loses everything, except we happen to not lose this one small town we own, and we'll go live there. This is kind of like that. They didn't lose it all. They gave it all up in this case. They still had a bunch of money. Except
for that small island they own.
Yeah, except for that small island.
It's the same thing. It really is like that show.
Yeah. And so this is where the TV show added some extra background detail. We pointed out that they gave a name to one of Aenar's wives, the one who's Daenys' mother. That's, again, Elena. And Hot D portrays her as sort of trying to live the lifestyle as if she was still in Valyria, just kind of stubbornly behaving that way and still spending money as if they had the incomes they used to have, that's a fish out of water trope right there. You get the rich family that still acts like they're rich and powerful, but they're living around a bunch of people who don't even care that they're rich, or are not impressed by it, or variety of different shenanigans pop up. So there you go. Here is another quote to fill out the picture a bit more. Here it is, quote.
At its apex, Valyria was the greatest city in the known world, the center of civilization. Within its shining walls, 20 rival houses vied for power and glory in court and council, rising and falling in an endless, subtle, oft savage struggle for dominance. The Targaryens were far from the most powerful of the dragonlords, and their rivals saw their flight to Dragonstone as an act of surrender, as cowardice. But Lord Aenar's maiden daughter, Daenys, known forever afterward as Daenys the Dreamer, had foreseen the destruction of Valyria by fire, and when the doom came, 12 years later, the Targaryens were the only dragonlords to survive.
Again, the mention of maiden daughter Daenys. That's almost always included here as an important detail, or as a detail. So we assume it's important or notable because of that. Nina has another good theory here. The mockery from the other dragonlords might imply that Aenar didn't tell them. He got the prophecy from his daughter. He believed it, but then made up some other reason why he was leaving. Didn't say we're leaving because we know the doom or a doom is coming. We believe this entire continent's going to explode, so we're leaving. That's another angle to this that is a very worthy thought. That explains a lot. That explains why they didn't leave, because they didn't know about it. Aenar was the only one to learn, or the only important, historically notable person to hear about it, and he didn't tell anyone else other than, his allies, the ones who were going to leave with him.
Do you think he didn't tell anyone else because he wanted profit, gain, or because he didn't want to be further made fun of?
Maybe a little of both, yeah. Like, he may have seen the long-term advantage of being the only dragonlords to survive, which is what happened, but in order to pull that off, he would have to suffer. He'd have to do the John Connington kind of thing, like pretend that the shame was earned. Like, yeah, I drank myself to death in exile. But he's all just waiting for, 15 years later, 17 years later, are going to come back and we'll show you. Well, they won't actually get shown. They'll just be exploded. They'll just be gone. But either way, it's a long-term play that did work. You got to say it worked. If that's what he was aiming for, it played out brilliantly. and of course they're not going to look for reasons. They're like, why is he really leaving? Does he know about something we don't? No. They're just going to be glad that one of these 40 families is leaving. They're going to laugh at them for being weak, but they're also going to be happy that that's just one less seat at the table to fight over. Right? So some other smaller family might be able to move up and take their place amongst the 40 families. Not that it's literally 40 at all times, probably. That's just an estimate. But still, it does create an opening. There's a small power vacuum that could be filled for about 12 years until they're all gone. The bigger power vacuum came afterwards. But 12 years is a long time. Did doubt start to creep in? Was Aenar like, nope, it's going to happen. Be patient, y'all. Or were some of his vassals like, this was a mistake. I'm going back. Some of them returned to Valyria. Yeah, I got antsy,
Can you imagine if someone's like, I'm just going to go back for a quick visit. And it was that week.
It was that week. Whoops. Bro, I would not go. It could happen anytime. It's like a ticking time bomb. Yeah, it could be tomorrow. It could be 5 years from now. But who takes that risk?
Yeah, you've been told that for 10 years and you're like, I'm going. Okay, I'm going. And then you're like, oh no.
Oh no. Did she have more visions? Did she have follow-ups? It's like, yo, I have not had another vision about this. It's been 5 years and I haven't had another one. They'd be like, were you wrong? Or is this 50 years in the future? Yeah. There's no timeline for these visions. These things aren't notated with timestamps. She's not like, oh yeah, in the dream there were numbers. There was a chart. Yeah, I got it all. Don't worry. I have a photographic memory. Nah, of course not. How would she have any sort of sense of when? You know what I mean? I have an image of Valyria exploding, but what's going to tell her the timeline of that, she could have a sense of it, oh, it's soon, but maybe not. Might just be yep, at some point in the future, this will happen. But we also, that's a general question about how this all works. What triggers her vision? Does she know when they're coming? Can she sit there and concentrate? Or is it just kind of random? Red Priest can gaze into the flames. That's a trigger for them. If it goes to Highheart, I don't even know. She can just seem to do it at will. So we really don't know how it works for Daenys. If we go by other Targaryen dreamers, it is sort of out of their control. It just kind of happens. But she is kind of unique in a lot of ways, so maybe it's a little more straightforward. Maybe it's a little more like Makoro or the Ghost of Highheart, where she can just kind of rattle off facts about the world, just by thinking about it. Just kind of like the Ghost of Highheart just will tell them where Beric was. Well, you came to me to find Beric. He's there. He's over here. There's a wedding at the twins coming up. She just knows these things. So Daenys, that's not usually how Targaryen dreamers are portrayed, but we don't exactly have a lot of basis here for what it's supposed to be like. So yeah, that's very much an open line here. Here's another little tidbit I like. This is show canon, but it's a good little take that I enjoy. This line is given to us by the animated history of the Seven Kingdoms. Imagine Harry Lloyd's voice saying this because he's the narrator for this line. Legends claim that his daughter foresaw the destruction of the city in a dream. More likely, Aenar met with some mishap at court and chose exile over execution. So even the show extra bonus material is like entertaining the idea that Aenar made it up to save face, which is cool because we love the deconstruction of myths and legends. George does a lot of that. So I appreciate the show having Viserys, of all people, scoff at it, because Viserys is he's the experiencing the end of the Targaryen dynasty. So a part of him might resent the notion that they were that powerful in the past. He's like, yeah, it wasn't that big. He loves the idea of them having dragons and all that stuff. He can't deny that. But the idea of this is like, he's cynical about it. And, but that's what it is, I think. It's not history. This is Viserys' opinion. But it's a valid opinion. It's considering deconstruction of myths and legends is a valid way to approach the material. So yeah, let's see how this fits. Is this a possibility for a made-up thing or not? And then go from there. So what about after? What about after the doom? What life must have been like? It must have been just like, wow. It's hard to imagine, but we can at least give it a shot. There's another line from Harry Lloyd's Viserys. Quote, then Aenar's descendants settled into it like a tomb for their lost homeland. So again, he's just denigrating his ancestors, saying they were all pining for the glory days of... What a hypocrite. Pining for the glory days, eh, Viserys? Doesn't sound like you at all, does it? So he's projecting, I think, because they must have been sad over their lost glory like I am.
Those histories and lores are good for like capturing the character psyche a lot of the time very well. Yeah,
they're surprisingly solid even though show canon differs, they're surprisingly good. Even though they differ, you have to keep your canon straight. When we're dealing with canon like this, so little of it is settled, which is why we have more time for TV show content today. Even though this is still overwhelmingly book content, the TV show stuff gets a mention. It wouldn't take long for them to know that the doom had happened, right? There would be like visual signs. You could look out the window of Dragonstone and probably see the smoke in the distance, and there would be waves and stuff. And it wouldn't be long before merchant ships arrived with the news like, yo, that continent's gone. There were some people that were close enough to it that survived, like maybe in Volantis, which is just outside the continent, that it didn't sink, but maybe 10 miles, 20 miles, 30 miles west or east, it did. So there might have been some incredible visual like witnesses, people who saw it happen, and their stories would be sought after by people in power. They'd want to know what happened, and just the immediate aftermath, people writing down their reasons, the rumors, the stories. Just there's nothing like it in the real world for us to point to. Like, remember that day that entire continent vanished? What's the modern equivalent? Like China sinking into the sea? I mean, China's not Valyria. Like the U.S. maybe, the entire east coast of the U.S., like New York and the eastern seaboard sinking into the sea. Is that the closest thing we can think of? Well, yeah, nothing like that's ever happened. Atlantis? That didn't really happen. Atlantis is a myth. But the idea of it is as close as we can get, maybe. And that's only one city, not a whole, like, civilization. So, weird. Yeah, did Aenar, like, hop on his dragon and fly over there to take a look for himself? Seems like a reasonable thing to do. Like, he would have a unique way to go see for himself. Maybe Gaiman went with him. Maybe Daenys went.
Probably couldn't get very close.
No, they probably couldn't get very close. The air would be toxic, but they could at least get close enough to be like, whoa, this is really bad. Like, we're not even close, and we can't go any farther. That alone would be stunning, Wow. And she might have follow-up visions, like she would see the blasted landscape of Valyria, and then she could go fly out and see it and be like, yep, confirmed. I dreamed of this. Crazy thing. Just it's again, I use this example in the intro. I hope I'm wrong, but I think the hope Valyria is going to explode. And then it happened. That's not satisfying to be right about that. She would spend that whole decade going, I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. And then it actually happens. Like, that would make any dream you ever have of something bad just frightening. Like, oh God, there's another one. Of course, nothing else would probably ever be this bad, but maybe it would be. In the second half of the episode, we're going to discuss all the potential things she could have seen in other dreams. Like, did she see the Balerion's future? Did she see the Dance of the Dragons? There's a lot of examples like that we got to consider. And it may have kicked off a whole new wave of dreams for her. This is a new world now. Valeria's gone. The world is vastly changed in a second. The full extent of those changes takes a while to play out, but she might have dreams of that, of the new world, of what's going to happen. Maybe she dreamt of Gagasos' rise and then death to, well, the Red Death, the plague that wiped them out. These are just massive world events that could have popped up in her mind. Maybe not, because they don't have anything to do with her directly, but we don't know how these things work. What is the nature of prophecy? Do you see things that are irrelevant to you entirely, that you have no perspective for? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe you just don't write those down because you don't know what to say. More of the after.
Can I say a thing?
You should say a thing.
You know, you're talking about her mother, Elena, and T's concept for her or whatever, and her being kind of, I don't know, a fashionista. She likes to spend money or whatever, right? Well, anyways, the idea just that Daenys might have had a conflict with her mother the whole time they're there, where her mother's resenting her for making them come there. So there would be moments where Daenys was like, man, I hope I'm right. Oh God, I'm messed up in the head for thinking a whole continent. But like, she would have had to have had moments where she was like, I'm tired of justifying myself. All these people, like not just her mother, but probably many people resented her for making them all come. And so she has to have had moments where she was like,
a pariah.
I hope I'm right.
Yeah.
And then she felt bad for hoping she was right.
Yeah, it's like, if I'm right, all these people die. If I'm wrong, then all these people are correct to label me like an outcast or a pariah. At least her father was on her side, you know, so that helps. At least he seemed to be on her side. Maybe he even started to waffle a bit. You never know.
Yeah, exactly. Like anytime anyone doubts her, she would have these moments where she's like, "Oh, I hope I'm right," but she doesn't want to be right. Anyways, it's just really complex. It had to have been very troubling to her.
It really would. Like, this is the thing. Like, in any media, in any story, in any fantasy element, sci-fi, you name it. If there's anyone who can predict the future, they are unhappy. It's almost 99.9%. Like, it's super hard to think of an example of a character who can predict the future or who has access to the future and it goes well for them. Like, what are the exceptions? Like, I don't know, Back to the Future when not even really. Like, Biff stole the sport almanac book so he could win bets, and that ruined the future. So, like, everything's bad. It's universally bad, and George isn't. That's not a trope. George reverses, like, yeah, we're going to stick with prophecy equals bad because it causes conflict. Like, it's too easy to look at and see how that would screw you up. It's hard to look at that and be like, yeah, this is a benefit, you know, seeing what's going to happen. It takes the savor out of life. You just know everything that's going to happen. There's so many reasons why it's bad. Very few reasons why it's good, although there are some. This is the drought era right now, with the news that the Night of Seven Kingdoms show is pushed to January or February. It's going to be quite a while between show seasons. House of the Dragon is obviously really far between seasons. It's a lot of production effort to get that done. So this is kind of like a low point for the fandom. There's always still we never run out of things to talk about. We have a list of topics that's never going to run out, like literally, but definitely fewer people are interested in Game of Thrones content right now than, let's say, they will be in a year. That's just how it is. It waxes, it wanes. There's ups and downs. The fandom is always very strong, but it can be more or less from a certain baseline. So that's why we really rely on y'all this time of when we're in these low points, when the fandom's in a bit of a drought era, because there's just not as many people around that are interested. So we rely on you, the hardcore fans, to keep us going. And the best way to do that is through Patreon. Sign up for whatever level fits you best. We have quite a few options there as far as the level of your participation, and we give a lot back. If you sign up, you get access to our polls, to our bonus episodes, of which there's quite a few these days. I couldn't even list them all. We have, well over a dozen extra episodes, so you can get, just for $5 a month, you can get all that. It's a pretty good deal, especially if you listen to us regularly. It's a good way to go back. That's how I do it. The shows that I consume the most are the shows that I donate to. I think it's a pretty good way to go about business. Once again, that's patreon.com, History of Westeros. Several questions from y'all today, which I think is great. I love getting questions from y'all. This is an interesting topic and one that's fraught with mystery and difficult questions to answer. D-Cell says, is it mentioned how old of a religion R'hllor is? Like, does it predate Valyrian religion? We don't know. No, we don't know how old it is, but I believe it's extremely old. Like, it's older than we know. Some of the records may have been lost when the Doom happened. Like, there may have been ancient records of how it began, because we're pretty sure it got its start in Valyria. It became monotheistic, which is when it became kind of hostile to the other religions there. So they left because they wanted to be in a place that wasn't open to other religions. They wanted to establish themselves as the only religion. And, well, in the long term, that kind of happened. I mean, they aren't the only religion, but they are the most powerful and numerous in Essos. So, yeah, that's kind of hard to say. Now, a couple of y'all, Sir Rogar and Pyramidion, for example, are totally on the Balerion having a connection to the dreams here. Like, whether it's Balerion directly giving Daenys the dream, like the power of the dragon contains some of this prophetic energy that Daenys can tap into and see through the dragon's eyes. We've seen little bits of supernatural connectivity between Targaryens and their dragons. You know, it's not as powerful as the skin changer bond, but there's a little something there that goes beyond just, you know, pet and human, right? There's definitely a little more to it than that. And you know, there's things like Balerion will go back to Valyria with Erea riding him, and we'll see the Doom, the effect of the Doom, which maybe that's something that Daenys saw, was Balerion's future vision up close, like with his own eyes, of what Valyria turned into. So a vision of the future through her dragon's eyes. That's fitting. That could work, right? That's not stretching the way the supernatural powers seem to work in this world. Here's an old tweet from Glidus. Shout out to Glidus. Big fan of Glidus. We had him and Alt-Shift-X hanging out at our house last year. That was good times.
I wish I could do this in his voice.
Me too. Balerion really was the main character, wasn't he? Foresaw the Doom, cyclically warned his rider Daenys, forged the Seven Kingdoms in his flames, ruled over it for decades, took a kid on a deadly joyride so he could see home one last time, and died due to Viserys' cringe. Glidus is hilarious. That is a great take. And where is the lie? What's wrong about all that? This is a valid interpretation too. It's a little comical, but it's also like, yeah, that all adds up. That all aligns.
You could go to our Balerion the Black Dread episode for main character Balerion action.
Yeah, we were on that tip as well. Here's a possible ancestor of Balerion. Cannibal the Dragon says, are the dragons sending the dreams, or is someone else sending them to get things they want, like the Children of Forest? Maybe they're just like subconscious projectors of dreams. Like I feel like they're too beastly and animalistic to be like, you know, like the intelligent dragons of some stories like Smaug or whatever. They're not that. But yeah, they are magical beings that could, you know, project energies that humans could pick up on, like a radar.
You meant descendant, not ancestor.
Oops, yeah, descendant. Yeah, not ancestor. Yes. The cannibal was descendant of Balerion, not ancestor of. Yes, much later. Balerion, older. Probably. There is some doubt, but yes, Balerion probably older. Christina K says, fun thing I noticed about Targaryen names, a lot of the Rey named women were or should have been queens, and it sounds a lot like Reina, R-E-I-N-A, which means queen. Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I wonder if George did that on purpose. That's interesting. Huh. Maybe further research is called for in this case, Christina K. Good one. Magister 343 says, do we know that Daenys and Gaiman had the same mother? Valyrians tended to be polygamous. Actually, that's a good call. We don't. The family tree, we kind of do, though, because the family tree says they both come from the same pairing, even though we know that there were multiple wives for Aenar. And George did do that family tree. So probably, but if George, I think he gave himself room to maybe change that. But I would suspect it's the same mother. But that's a very good call, Magister 343. It's not a sure thing. Bryson Chung says, the only happy future seers I can think of are the Second Foundation and the Foundation series. They seem pretty okay with being entirely a secret as the galaxy collapsed around them. Yeah. Yeah, so even then, even in this positive future vision, they're still amidst just everything going horribly. Like human civilization collapsing into a dark age in this sci-fi setting, which is a big part of Foundation.
Shout out to that show, which is coming back in July.
Yeah, that's true. Yes, it is. Poofball sends another super chat, says, Daenys had a werewood tree bed. Just kidding. Well, it's possible. The Valyrians, the Targaryens, they brought in all sorts of fancy things from Westeros, and they wanted the rare woods, and it's possible. It's possible, actually. Let's talk about the Century of Blood. Given that we know, given all these mentions of her being a maiden before the Doom, most of her life was probably during the Century of Blood after it. She was probably in her mid-20s when the Doom happened, maybe even a little younger. And unless she died young, which is possible, then we got to figure she lived probably 20, 30, maybe 40, 50 even years on Dragonstone after the Doom. Here's a relevant quote for us.
Yet, even so, for the best part of 100 years after the Doom of Valyria, the rightly named Century of Blood, House Targaryen looked east, not west, and took little interest in the affairs of Westeros. Daemon Targaryen, brother and husband to Daenys the Dreamer, followed Aenar the Exile as Lord of Dragonstone and became known as Daemon the Glorious. Daemon's son, Aegon, and his daughter, Elena, ruled together after his death.
We don't know how long Aenar lived, but he was probably still Lord when the Doom occurred, which would have given him that grim satisfaction in knowing he made the right call and knowing that his family was now the only family of dragonlords in the world. That's pretty huge, right? But again, these intervening years might have been very difficult. We already have this take on Daenys' mother, Elena, and her still trying to live like a socialite in a backwater, what she would have seen as a backwater. And there's just the kind of people she would hang around with just literally don't exist anymore. And if there were other wives, there could have been unhappiness as they just had nothing to do, none of their old friends, none of their old society, just this place that they shunned forever. They didn't care about Westeros. They looked on it as a backwater. Now they have to live there? Yeah, like, it wouldn't have been pretty. It wouldn't have been happy. It wouldn't have been a happy environment, especially with what some of these theories about, maybe Daenys herself was looked down on, or they resented her for that. Even after the Doom happened, even after she was right, they wouldn't, they're too proud, a lot of these people, probably to apologize. Okay, you were right. Maybe one or two of them did, but a lot of them would still 12 years of resentment. They just can't undo that. They're still resentful. It's set by that point. That's just a pattern. It's a habit at that point. It's no longer governed by a logical outcome. It's like, no, I've resented you for 12 years, even though you don't deserve it anymore because you were right. I still resent you, And again, it comes back to this point of, when are prophets ever happy? So you've got probably unhappy Daenys, probably unhappy household, probably unhappy everything, probably, the world they live in now, the Doom, that like everybody they knew is dead. There's a lot to look at here and think, they were probably kind of miserable. Maybe they made the most of it, but there's a lot of evidence, or at least circumstantial evidence, that would lead to a conclusion of they were unhappy. They were unhappy. And this also, as a bit of an aside, this is partly why the Targaryens didn't exercise their power in Westeros sooner. Why Aegon and his sisters, when they did the conquest, this was a big change of policy, or a big change of perspective, because they were still stuck in Essos. Even though they moved to Westeros, all their interests, their lifestyle, their thousands of years of history were still set in Essos. All their business connections that might still exist, they might still have trade with Volantis and Lys and Pentos and all that. They would have maybe some distant relatives there. They might have some land in some of those other places, So they still have connections to a lot of these places, connections that they wouldn't yet have in Westeros and weren't trying to establish because they looked down on it. Even though they lived there, they were still like a little bit of separation. It was like, yeah, we're not like these other Westerosi. We're still Valyrians. They wanted to hold on to that identity, even though it was a dead identity. And I guess this is when she got her nickname, right? It said there in one of those quotes we read, it said, thereafter she was known as Daenys the Dreamer. So yeah, once the doom came and word got out that she had predicted it, if it hadn't already been out there, then yeah, like, oh, that's the girl that predicted this? Whoa. In a land where, half of people get nicknames, yeah, of course she got one there. Like people, you would think like some people would be in awe of her. Like some of the servants at Dragonstone that knew she had predicted, they'd be like, oh my God, like she predicted that. Wow. What are the winning lottery numbers, Daenys? Let's check out her brother husband a bit. Gaemon the Glorious. What a pair, those names together. Gaemon the Glorious and Daenys the Dreamer, Lord and Lady of Dragonstone ruling over Blackwater Bay.
Lord and Lady of Alliteration.
That's right. So, assuming Aenar was still alive during the Doom, Gaemon would have been heir, along with his sister, but he would be the primary, to the only dragonlord family in the world, if he wasn't already that, because it's possible that Aenar died and he was already Lord when the Doom came. What made him glorious, though? Why was he so glorious? An interesting time to earn that nickname, right? The Century of Blood. We know why Daenys had her nickname. It's extremely straightforward. But glorious is like, that's kind of not very specific, is it? It certainly makes him sound like he was big, successful, right? If you called him, Fire and Blood says he was the greatest Targaryen lord of the Century of Blood. That doesn't tell us anything. What greatest is about as specific as glorious, right? He was successful, competent, powerful. I guess you could at least say he probably wouldn't have gotten that nickname if he had been short-lived. If he had only ruled for a few years, there's not a lot of time to acquire such a big name like that. Glorious. Like, you got to earn that one. Like most Targaryens didn't have names that were so unabashedly positive like that. Even Aegon the Conqueror is like, that's an intimidating, respectable name. But Conqueror isn't like necessarily like a compliment. I mean, in most circles it is in Westeros, but it's not as straightforward as great or glorious, So, his mother and father, we don't know how well Aenar adapted. We know from show canon that his mother didn't, assuming that was his mother, Elena. Maybe Gaemon adapted better. He moved there as a younger man. So did Daenys as a younger woman. So maybe they were able to make the most of it, adapt better, because they didn't miss Valyria as much. They weren't as attached to it, right? Maybe they even embraced their new life. They found a way to like it, But because of that focus, east rather than west, there is this sort of clinging to the past idea that sort of foreshadows over the whole thing, right? And if they're looking east, well, what does that mean? It must be dealing with the free cities. That's the power that still exists there. That's who filled the power vacuum of Valyria being gone, at least on this side of Essos. On the other side of Slaver's Bay, obviously the Giscari were on the rise again, and as we mentioned before, Gogassos was emerging as a power in the Basilisk Isles. And some of these may have been people that Dragonstone had dealings with, but we're guessing it was the more regional people, the more regional players they were involved with. And it's interesting to consider. Yes, Dragonstone had been built, the castle was there, but was it fully built? Was it in its final form? Did the Targaryens add to it? They certainly developed the island more like building of small towns and smaller holdfasts and maybe expanding the agriculture. Ditto Driftmark. So we can't just assume, and we shouldn't think of it as they moved to Dragonstone and it's the Dragonstone of today. No, definitely not. It was held by petty lords back in those days, and they wouldn't have had the money to fully develop it into the way it is now. Ditto Driftmark, as I said, like Driftmark building all its ports, building Hull and Spice Town, these other things that popped up later, right? Now, Daenys, if she was the type of dreamer that could just rattle things off, that just could be like the Ghost of Highheart and be like, yeah, there's going to be ships over here, this lord's going to go on this day to this place, if she just knows things, then that could explain part of why Gaiman was Gaiman the Glorious. If he just like had this direct line to future events, right? That would give you a big leg up, right? Now, we got to ask the question, though. Is that really how George uses prophecy or foretelling in A Song of Ice and Fire? It's debatable. Again, Melisandre makes a lot of errors, but the Ghost of Highheart, we coming back to her as an example. She just like knows where people are with a snap of the fingers. So, yeah, I'd say yes, it does work that way sometimes. Makoro as well makes some very specific, mundane predictions. He says, yeah, I'll tell you, Victarion, where some of your lost ships are. And he's right. Victarion's separated from a bunch of his ships and they find some. Then he tells them where they can find prey. He's like, you're going to go over here and there's going to be some merchant ships. He's very specific about it and he's right. So this begs a question of like different types, different categories of prophets, visionaries, dreamers. They don't all work the same. Some of them just have constant flood of visions. Some of them only do because of where they are. Like the Ghost of Highheart, if she left the werewood stump spot she lives in, if she left Highheart, would her vision still work so well? Probably not. Because explicitly, her Thoros' visions don't work well there because it's a magic that he can't tap into that maybe interferes with other magics. Like a signal interfering with another signal. So we don't really know how to categorize Daenys as a prophet. What category of visionary is she? So I don't think she was this kind, but maybe she was. It would explain a lot about why Gaiman was Gaiman the Glorious. But it may be more likely it's just he was just competent, intelligent, took advantage of his circumstances effectively. So they're children, Aegon and Elena, plus another daughter. There's a third child from them who's unnamed, and her descendants will pop up later. So hold on to that thought for now, but just to focus on Aegon and Elena for a minute. Just as Gaiman and Daenys married, so did these two. So they continued the sort of, at this point, unbroken line of Targaryens marrying brother to sister. So 4 generations later is Aegon, Rhaenys, and Visenya. So this Aegon was the great-great-grandfather of Aegon, Rhaenys, and Visenya. And Elena, of course, was their great-great-grandmother. Now, that other unnamed daughter, she married a petty lord. We don't. That's probably not Valyrian, since Valyrian's not petty. Petty usually means like they have the title of lord, but they don't actually have land. Again, the Cassels, the Pools of Stark fame. So again, this could be Coharis or Baratheon, something like that. Or it could be a vassal of the Valyrians, like one of the other smaller families on Driftmark. Like, for example, the Tollets are sworn to the Royces, and the Beesberries are sworn to the Hightowers. And then the Hightowers, in turn, are sworn to Highgarden. So, yeah, it could be one of these relationships. And some of these houses are so small that we don't even know all their names. Like, there's lesser houses that would be part of... that George could name tomorrow in A Song of Ice and Fire, and it wouldn't be weird because they're just so tiny. Maybe they've got 50 fighters to their name, or 2 ships, you know, some of Stannis' extremely lesser noble houses of the Narrow Sea. Would it be hard for Aegon and Elaine to be the child of a woman who was a prophet like that? Because if we take what we've said about how difficult it is to be a prophetess and to be burdened with this foreknowledge, it might not make you a great mother. Like, you're too burdened by all this, the weight of everything you know and everything you know that's going to happen. All these things we've said about how unhappy it might make you. Like, that doesn't exactly make for a good picture as a parent, does it? Like, it'd be hard to be positive. It'd be hard to, like, be happy all the time, which is what you want for your children. You want to present a positive image. You want to, pump them up and be happy and provide that environment. But it'd be difficult living in the shadow of the doom, living in the shadow of the Century of Blood, living in the death of their entire culture. Like, what a strange, unique scenario. So it's really hard to put ourselves in their shoes. But you can see how a lot of it would be kind of negative. But there would be positives, too. They're the only dragonlord family in the world. That would be a point of pride. The future might still be bright, despite the past. There might be things to look forward to. A lot of it's just kind of attitude, I guess. Like some people would look down on all this, and it would bring them down and make them depressed. But others could see the silver linings to their scenario, their situation. And these kids, well, they can't miss Valyria. They didn't know it. It's definitely different for Daenys and Gaiman, and even more so for their parents who spent most of their lives in Valyria and had to give that up. This Aegon and Aelena, they're the first generation of Targaryens born in Westeros. That's a huge deal. So they don't miss Valyria. They only have stories of it, right? They don't know anything about it. It's kind of like Dany, only getting stories of the Seven Kingdoms from her brother, except that Aegon and Aelena probably got more accurate stories than what Viserys told Dany. But everything she knows about her family and Westeros and the usurper comes from Viserys. So, that's kind of going to be the same here. They're going to learn about their family and Valyria and the Doom from just these elder members of their family, because everybody else who knew these things is dead, right? Maybe only a few other members of their extended family whose names we don't have would be the only other people that they could talk to about this. What a strange thing, right? Bryson Chung says, glorious could simply mean the man was a peacock, like he dressed really fancy, as a way to overcompensate or something like that. A satire. It could be a mocking name. Probably not, because it actually says he was the greatest lord of that generation of the Targaryens. That's what the World of Ice and Fire says, or Fire and Blood says that. And I doubt they would call him that just because he dressed well. But you never know. Again, a lot of these histories are written for, with the Targaryens made to look good. They kind of put a spin on it, put a little silver lining on it, spruce it up a bit. So it's possible. And I like the thought process regardless. Good one, Bryson. Let's talk about Signs and Portents, the book itself. We don't have any of her other prophecies. The only one we know for sure is the Doom. But we do know for sure that there were others because she wrote a whole book, right? How could it not be? Yeah, there's 3 pages of this book are all that survive, apparently. And if it's a book, it's not a novella. It's not a booklet. It's not a pamphlet. It's a book. So we don't know if it's a big book or a skinny book, but it's there's a little, it had some oomph to it.
Let's say some of the prophecies were really mundane. She's like, I predicted my daughter would break my favorite vase, that kind of thing.
As she's writing it, she hears the crashing sound, I was right. And I think these 3 pages are a place maybe the story could expand a little bit, because Marwyn is the one that found those 3 pages, allegedly. And Marwyn's on his way right now, allegedly, to go see Dany. He might tell her about it. He might be, look, yo, I'm your connection to these figures like Daenys the Dreamer and your ancient ancestors and these prophecies that are associated with your house. So we first mentioned Signs and Portents in the first mentioned section. Roderick the Reader has the Book of Lost Books, which is a book of lost books, a book that describes books that don't exist anymore. And Signs and Portents is one of those books featured in the Book of Lost Books. So Signs and Portents would be about 400 years old because she wrote it just before the Doom, 12 years before the Doom, right? She wrote it presumably before they went to Westeros. But maybe during that time. Maybe she was writing those things down. Maybe she didn't have as much to do when she got to Westeros. She's like, I'm bored. I'm going to write down more of my visions. But it's a curious name, right? Signs and Portents. It's not dreams and visions, it's not the dragon, Confessions of a Dragon Dreamer, Signs and Portents. It's interesting, yeah. So I wonder where do we suppose Marwyn found those 3 pages? I think the obvious guess is Ashai. But that's not by any means the definitive answer for sure. We shouldn't be like, oh, well, that has to be it. No, Marwyn's a man who's gone all over looking for obscure knowledge. He goes to, who knows where else he's been in his quest for lost arcana. Ashai is just a great theory, but we really have no idea. He's been everywhere. It's also possible 3 pages were copied down in another book. Like some other book used signs and portents as a source and copied a little of that over. And it's like, here, I'm quoting this book in my book. And that's why we have that. That's actually a fairly common way in the real world where we learn about books that we don't have anymore because they get referred to as a source in a book that does survive. I'm going to use this as the example of Beowulf is only around today because a single version was copied into a surviving manuscript that contains some other things. If not that, we would have lost that story forever. Amazing, right? And just on the other side of that is think of all the stories that we could have today, if not for a quirk here too, like a random event of history that caused a certain library to burn down, or who knows. So Signs and Portents would be a valuable book, though, and that might be why it wasn't copied, because the Targaryens might have seen it as something that they wanted to keep to themselves. They're like, these, especially if given how they benefited from the Doom, being the only dragonlord family, like there was immense profit in that prophecy, the prophecy of prophets. And they could see that a certain Gaemon the Glorious or Aegon after him might be, this Signs and Portents is kind of like trade secrets. We're not sharing this, which would help explain why the book doesn't exist anymore. We've seen multiple Targaryens who find things in books that change their outlook on prophecy. We don't always know why they were looking in the first place. Rhaegar is a good example. Aerys the First, right? These are other examples. Any Targaryen who has dreams, let's say you're a Targaryen and you start to have dreams, prophetic dreams, you're probably aware that you're not the first one in your family to have that. So what are you going to do? You're going to go look at books written by your ancestors about their dreams. So Signs and Portents, if other Targaryens had access to it, you gotta think, even the ones who didn't have dreams would probably be curious about it, but the ones who did would be particularly curious because they would be like, yeah, the way she's writing about it, that's kind of how it works in my brain. Like the way these images are described, the way she has these dreams, just the way they manifest, the way she puts it into words, that lands with me, me being whatever random Targaryen we're speaking of here. Like, was Aerys the First? Was he looking for evidence that the dragons would return? Or was he just like really into old books and he stumbled on that? Was it something he looked for, or is it something he found? Right? That's an open question. And same with Rhaegar. Was Rhaegar just bookish and he landed on that? Or was he like looking for answers? Because if you're looking for answers, sometimes you see what you want to see. And that's a big part of how George writes. A lot of people, especially when it comes to prophecy, and Rhaegar was certainly a man that seems to have fallen into that bucket of people that maybe believed a little too much in their own destiny. And yeah, like Ashaya suggested before, like dreamers can be there's a large scale here. If Daenys is maybe at the top of the scale where she just had lots of them, you could have like someone that just like every few months has a vague prophetic dream that's minor, a glimpse into the future that isn't fire and brimstone doom stuff, but yeah, a vase getting broken, like Ashaya's example, it's like, hey, I had a dream of that. Is it just a coincidence that I dreamt of that and then it happened? Or you might think it's just a coincidence, but if you were some other family, but if you're come from a family that has a history of prophetic dreamers, like Daenys, a famous one, you might be like, yeah, I'm a descendant of her. I'm a descendant of that woman who had very powerful prophetic dreams. You might start to believe in yourself, like Rhaegar did, or maybe in Aerys. And that explains a lot, doesn't it? Some of these Targaryens, some of their own beliefs and their own dreams and their own magic goes a little far. But if you add this angle in, it starts to make a lot more sense that they're just believers because their whole family is predisposed to believe because they only exist because of a dreamer. Jaehaerys II, he listened to the ghost of Highheart when she said the prince that was promised would be born of their line. A woods witch! That was weird. When Dany hears about this, she's like, what? That's crazy. My family listened to a woods witch about a prophecy? That's bizarre. But if you pair it with this knowledge that they're believers, it's been such a part of their history, it makes so much more sense. He was primed. Jaehaerys II was primed to believe in such things because his family exists only because of they believed in prophecy. They took that leap of faith. It might seem like a leap of faith to them now. Maybe it wasn't because, like we said, Daenys probably proved herself. But they can imagine it in a lot of different ways 200 years later, 300 years later, right? It's the exact details of what happened back then won't be carried forward necessarily. And the Targaryens of now and of recent generations would have different interpretations. They might get a little imaginative with what really happened there because they don't have all the details. So yeah, compared to the Ghost of Highheart, Melisandre, Makoro, other Targaryen dreamers, hers is different in that it's considered historical. Bloodraven was Hand of the King and Master of Whispers. He was in the spotlight historically for a long time. We witness him use a glamour in the Mystery Knight. And of course, later he merges with the Werewood. But of course, none of that's in the histories, though. There's just like, in the histories, there's mention of him whispering being involved with sorcery. But there's no corroborating evidence. There's no like, and we know this because, no, it's just, they're presenting it as history in that the history of this person, Bloodraven, was that people believed this about him. They are not willing to say it's true, even though we as readers know it is. He definitely had magical powers. He's using them now. But yeah, Daeron the Drunken, he was troubled by dreams. That's about as far as the histories go. They're not willing to confirm that they were prophetic, though. We know they are, though. Ditto John the Fiddler / Daemon II. These are not the matters of historical record. The Maesters and their hostility, maybe I'm using a word that's a little too strong, but denial maybe, or wish to get rid of magic in the world, this fits in with some of that. Either whether it's a concerted effort to get rid of magic or just their level of denial towards it or their downplaying of it or a combination of the above. Prophets usually aren't famous or remembered or given lots of ink by maesters, right? Now that the way we shouldn't close the book, pun intended, on all that, because not all the books that exist in the Citadel and elsewhere were written by maesters. Just a lot of them are. There's definitely books that predate the Seven Kingdoms. There's ancient books from who knows where that George is going to decide exist in the Citadel or elsewhere. So yeah, not all these books are going to fall into that auspice where they're problematic in that sense. There's other options. Since we don't know any of her other prophecies, what we did here was just kind of compile a short list of major events that followed her life that she might have foretold or seen coming. Mostly we're keeping this to events that affected the Targaryen dynasty, because if we get too big with it, well, I mean, what is she, just like picking up all world events? We got to narrow it down somewhat, in other words. So here, please, if you have ideas, this is a wonderful time to share with us. Tell us what visions you think Daenys might have had based on their importance to Targaryen history, or just the fact that they could be particularly vivid or interesting, or whatever you think. It's valid, probably, at least worth entertaining. We're working with very little here other than, well, big events tend to be the things that prophets see, so she might have seen some of these things, especially since they're associated with her family. So yeah, the births and deaths of famous Targaryens and dragons, maybe she foresaw the birth of Vhagar, a dragon that had such a huge impact on the Seven Kingdoms. Maybe she saw some of Vhagar's deeds. Less likely than Balerion's, though, because she's got the association with and bond with Balerion. So with that in mind, the birth of Aegon I, the rider of Balerion, or Viserys I, the one who oversaw the beginning of the dance. What about the conquest? Speaking of seeing through Balerion's eyes, the burning of Harrenhal? That's a big one, right? She could foresee that. The Field of Fire, arguably just as big, momentous. Like very historically important, memorable, visually stunning. Aegon's death. He just died of old age, but it triggered rebellions. Many rebellions throughout the Seven Kingdoms, his death. So maybe she saw that. Maybe she saw flashes of images of the various rebellions. Sigils. She could see sigils in her mind. Westeros is big with preloaded symbolism because of the sigils. Like, remember, the three-headed dragon was not a sigil of House Targaryen until they came to Westeros. Maybe she dreamt of that before it happened. That's a cool one. Very memorable, very symbolic, very distinct visually. What about the Song of Ice and Fire? Is she aware of the princess/prince that was promised prophecy? Is she aware of Azor Ahai? That one predates her. So she's probably aware of it, but did she have her own visions and dreams of it? That's a tempting thought, isn't it? Obviously, in show canon, Aegon had a dream about the Song of Ice and Fire. But book canon, we don't have to go with that. Yes, George has mentioned it as a possibility for book canon that Aegon had these dreams. Doesn't mean Daenys didn't have them first. Doesn't mean we could certainly be faced with a situation where Aegon had these dreams similar to his ancestor, similar to his great-great-great-grandmother, Daenys, and went and referenced her book and was like, signs and portents. He's looking at her book and he's like, I had that same dream. I had this. I saw this. I saw this too. Holy crap. Right? That's a big possibility. That she is maybe even the progenitor of the idea. Maybe the first one to have these visions, or at least the first ones to write it down. Maegor's Wars versus the Faith. Imagine the symbolism there. The Faith clashing with dragons, like the images in her head of the black dragon Balerion, her dragon again. Again, that's another reason this fits really well with Maegor, a figure who rings loud in Targaryen history. From her perspective, it would be in the future. And just so many people burned, all these faithful, like she could have images of the father, the mother, the crone on fire, or hacking the wings off a dragon. I don't know, just symbolic ways that his war with the Seven undercut the dynasty. What about Area's flight? We mentioned that one earlier. That's a big one. Seeing that vision through Balerion's eyes 150, 180 years ahead of time. That's crazy, right? Seeing the blasted landscape, images of that, knowing what she's seeing. It's like, yeah, this is Valyria after the Doom. What about something a little more mundane, but really in terms of visual imagery, but huge in Targaryen history, like the doctrine of exceptionalism? Isn't that kind of fun in a weird way to imagine the prophecy of important documents? That's weird, right? She's like, I keep having dreams of paper. But it's important paper for some reason. Yeah, because that is hugely important, right? The doctrine of exceptionalism was massive in changing how Westeros viewed House Targaryen going forward. It kind of allowed, it was sort of the grease of the wheels that enabled them all to get along. Because so much of Targaryen culture really did not work with how the Seven's predisposition towards things like incest, dragons, and even things like polygamy. So, and then Jaehaerys and Alysanne. What if there's a dream of this pair of rulers who, and that's a familiar sight, a Targaryen brother and sister ruling together, picturing them with their crowns. That's a big vision of the future, right? Like a king and queen ruling in the Red Keep. There's a lot of things you could picture, right? And imagining this era of peace, a golden age, right? That's something that's a good example, a rare example of a positive future that you could see. But shortly after that, only 30 years later after the death of Jaehaerys, you've got even less, really, by a little bit less, you've got the Dance of the Dragons. A lot of imagery possible there. Dragons in the storm, Vhagar and Arax, right? Vhagar burning the Riverlands with Aemond. A one-eyed Targaryen causing massive devastation, swirling green and black colors, right? Imagery of the two factions going against each other. A lot of visual possibilities here. Then, of course, the death of the dragons not long after the dance. Most of the dragons die during the dance, and they're completely gone less than 20 years later. That could be something she pictured. Maybe the image in her mind of that last stunted dragon, unhealthy and struggling to live, and with nobody understanding why. What about even farther down the line? The Great Bastards, the Blackfire Rebellions. If we imagine swirling greens and blacks, what about blacks and reds? What about all the various sigils of the important Great Bastards? Bittersteel's sigil, the inverted arms of Daemon. What about Shiera Seastar? Just because she's a fascinating, interesting figure. What about Summerhall? The death of so many Targaryens amidst green fire. What's that all about, right? She'd be seeing that like, wildfire? What are they doing? Comets? What about the Red Comet? What about the comet that came during Rhaegar's life? There's been other red comets too. What about the actual end of the dynasty? What about Aerys dead at the foot of the throne? Did she picture that? Did she picture the futures that didn't come to pass? Wildfire blowing up King's Landing, which might be a future that does come to pass, by the end of the books. Maybe she sees that. Maybe she sees the return of the dragons, another one that to her might seem positive. And it's a big one. So many post-draconic Targaryens dreamt of the return of dragons that it's very compelling to imagine Daenys did as well, although it's getting a bit ahead of herself there. That comes so much later after her life. But that's a rare one that's good, and that's I want to repeat that most of these major events are bad, Like, we could, if we thought harder about it, imagine some positive ones, and maybe those are there. Maybe Daenys had some. Maybe I'm being a little too negative here. But there could be prophecies of summer. Maybe Daenys saw the end of the others. If she saw the beginning of it, why not the end of it? Maybe she sees times of peace. Like again, I mentioned the Golden Age under Jaehaerys and Alysanne. Maybe she sees some of the other ones too. Visions of a post-Others world is maybe even too far ahead, but even that's possible. Visions of Jon Snow? Visions of things happening beyond the wall? Visions that other people have had. Like, this isn't a great example, but it is an example. Mother Mole had the visions of the free folk getting picked up and taken away to happier places. There's a lot of problems with that vision because some of the people picked up by the ships were taken away into slavery. Some of them did get away. So it's a good example of prophecy is a hilt without a sword. It's a sword without a hilt. Prophecy is a sword without a hilt. Hey, either way, it's a hilt without a sword, sword without a hilt. It's incomplete. It's half of the picture. You need both to wield it effectively. So, yeah, that's another way to look at it, and maybe she sees. Really, there's just no end to the momentous parts of A Song of Ice and Fire that you can imagine someone hundreds of years before who has a particular sensitivity to future visions seeing these things. Why lost? Why was the book lost? Okay, well, we already pointed out that probably there weren't many copies of it because they kept it as a trade secret. They wanted to keep these secrets to themselves. They wanted to use this information in the future for their own benefit and not for other people's. So yeah, why would they share it unless there was an advantage to sharing it? And what advantage would there be to sharing it? I don't really know. So one of the best examples, one of the best possibilities is you take that situation where you probably don't have a lot of copies of it, and then Baelor the Blessed, a burner of books, comes along. There's the flaw in that plan of not having a lot of copies of it. Now, we don't have to assume it was because of Baelor, but if the book survived to Baelor's time, then there's a very good chance that it was burned, right? If it wasn't lost before Baelor, then he probably took care of it. Unfortunately, the definite bad sign of the downside of Baelor there. There was a 1994 episode of the show Babylon 5, season 1, episode 13, called Signs and Portents. It did involve prophecy and an ancient artifact. I don't really know much more. I've never really watched Babylon 5, but I happened to stumble on this when doing research for this episode. I was like, oh, how about that? There was also a magazine called Signs and Portents that I think is now defunct, but it was a RPG/wargaming magazine, so it's possible George stumbled on that magazine and decided to borrow that title for Daenys' book. Who knows? Prophetess tropes. The Doom itself is like a straightforward variation of the local area version of the end of the world as we know it trope. So instead of the entire world, it's just Valyria, which is a lot, but not the whole world. And then the Century of Blood, which we went on to discuss. We discussed the virgin power tropes earlier and some related ones. Let's go a little farther than that. The end is nigh trope is a big one, as I just said, which is, you probably already understand what it is without hearing a description. The end is nigh. It's just a trope that says in this story is the idea that the world's going to end, or that something big is going to happen, very destructive. Maybe not the whole world, but yeah. Anyway, in real world ancient times, prophecy was often very political. And you can see why. It was dishonest. People were just making things up to get a political result. And very often it was the opposite, though. It's often real world prophecy, in quotes, prophecy, was not about the end, was not about big bad things happening. It's about bright futures after calamity. Like, something bad's going to happen, but after that, everything's going to be great. It's the change that will bring on the good times. We got to suffer a little to get to the promised land. The promised land concept is the one you should think of here when you're thinking of these type of prophecies. Prophecy is huge in the Bible, right? It was big in the ancient world. In Israel, Babylonia, other places, you know. Now, scholars aren't entirely sure why prophecy sort of mostly died out in the ancient world, but they think mostly it's because, well, it's all BS, right? Like, people just learned that this is mostly, people got more savvy. It's like, this is all just politicians just pretending this stuff is true, then justifying it post facto. And we're not that stupid anymore. We've figured out, we've gotten a little more sophisticated on that as a society, as a culture, as a civilization, depending on which civilization we're talking about. All humanity, maybe. So yeah, people just figured that out. Like, this isn't real. This is just something made up to get a result, to get people fired up, to get them to behave a certain way. And we're not falling for that anymore. Well, that's not true. People still fall for it. Nostradamus, he wasn't thousands of years ago. He was 500 years ago. The Israeli prophets from the Bible, that is thousands of years old. Now, if you remember our necromancy episode from earlier this year, you'll have learned that prophecy and necromancy are very connected in the real-life ancient world. In fact, specifically, you use necromancy to speak to dead spirits who will tell you the future. So that's very straightforward in that sense. And of course, that's very against God's law, according to the Bible. God's like, nope, only I can do that sort of stuff. So this is a little bit off the topic, but Nostradamus' work was not against Catholic teachings of the time, even though the Inquisition was around. Like, what? Yeah, they were against magic, but they weren't against prophecy or astrology, which is weird, right? Like, how can you say prophecy isn't magic? Well, you can, because it's bull. That's how you can say. It's a clever way of just looking down on it. Like, yeah, that stuff isn't real. That's why we don't call it magic, because it's fake. Of course, they're calling other things magic, so they're still sort of, in a way, admitting that magic is real, but not including prophecy in that category. It's all very strange. But anyway, most prophets, though, in fiction, in literature, it comes back to that image I put in your mind before of the street preacher with the sign going, repent. So you see madness very often associated with this, and you can see why. It's like a person that has inside information into the end of the world. That's not a very happy place to be, is it? Especially when no one's listening to you. Now, in this case, Daenys is the exception. People listen to her. They did listen to her, and it worked out pretty well, at least in the short term. And dragon dreams as well are associated with madness, right? Not necessarily everyone who has dragon dreams is mad, but it wears on your sanity. It rubs on you. It's a difficult thing. It's a burden to see the future, right? This is a recurring theme, not just in A Song of Ice and Fire, but not just in the real world, not just in other fantasy, but especially with Targaryen madness, because, well, there's already an association with Targaryens and madness, and there's already an association with Targaryens and dreaming, and there's a lot of overlap between those two things. Yes, the Targaryen madness concept is overstated, but the Targaryen dreamer stuff is not, and that is associated with some, maybe not madness, but mental health issues. Daeron the Drunken, for example, he wasn't mad, but he had severe mental health problems, right? Because of what the prophecies were doing to him. These visions messed him up. And again, these prophecies are rarely about good things, right? If Daeron is just like constantly having visions of awesome things, of a happy future, he's probably not drinking himself into a stupor. He's probably like, this is great. It's like, my mind is full of happiness all the time. I'm all seeing visions of good things. So these street preacher types in A Song of Ice and Fire, what's the equivalent? The Ghost of High Heart, kind of, except she's right. She's got the kind of crazy vibe about her that she's weird and a little off. But George inverts that a bit by having her be like nearly unerringly accurate. Maggie the Frog, she's a woods witch that's shunned. That people are like, oh, that's this creepy old ugly woman. But let's go be brave and see what she has to say. She's got blood magic, right? This is, it's brave Cersei and her friends as children. So, but these are not people that have high places in society. These are not respected individuals. Even those who are otherwise very well learned men like Marwyn and Aemon are outcasts within academic circles because of their belief in prophecy and in the supernatural. And they're right to believe in those things. They're the voices of reason within a mass of people who are disbelieving, right? And Daeron the Drunken, to keep on him because he's such a great example of this, he shuns a lot of the Targaryen lifestyle. He doesn't live like a highborn man. He goes to like the equivalent of dive bars. That's where Dunk meets him, right? He's not in fancy inns. He's not hanging out at like the Street of Silk. I mean, maybe he does when he's in King's Landing, but like he just wants a drink to forget. He doesn't really care. He's kind of trying to hide from the other nobility. He doesn't want to be recognized, So it's a little bit of an inversion here. We have Daenys being not just really highborn, but being the Lady of Dragonstone, being about as powerful as it gets within the family, other than being, lord or king, which is a huge inversion from Street Preacher or Ghost of High Heart or Maggie the Frog. And again, I come back to the visions, like the mechanism of these visions. Is when she's asleep? Is it random? Is she just in the middle of the day? She starts having visions. She's like, get my pen. I need to write this down right now. Is there anything she can do to make it happen? Can she try to enter a trance? Can she take some mushrooms or something? The most famous prophet or prophetess trope in all of the world probably is Cassandra, at least in Western civilization. Apollo, the Greek god, wanted her as a lover, and there's a few different versions of this. He gave her the gift of prophecy, and then she turned on him. Or he gave her the gift of prophecy, but was unsatisfied, even though she did everything that was asked of her. Typical unattainable deity standards. She was thus cursed by him for whatever the logic behind Apollo doing this was, whether he was just, being a jerk or whether she was genuinely broke the deal. The curse he put on her was apparently couldn't revoke the divine power he gave her. He gave her the power of prophecy and couldn't take that back. That's just not how it works. But he could give her and add something on top of it, which would curse her, which was that no one would believe her. So she would be right. She could see visions of the future, but the curse would be that no one would believe her, which honestly sounds like more of a curse on everybody else. Because she's like, hey, I have this vision of doom that we could all avert if you listen to me. So they can't listen to her because of the curse. It sounds like they all suffered because of that too. Because she's not an example of the lowborn prophet trope. She's a princess of Troy. She was the daughter of Priam and Hecuba and was the most beautiful of Priam's 50-some daughters. That's pretty outstanding, right? You got 50 royal daughters and she's the most good-looking of all of them. That's saying something. And that right there tells you what the prophecies were associated with. Of course, they're associated with the doom of Troy, the fall of Troy at the end of a very long Trojan War. And the Trojan War, the beginning of the Trojan War to the end of the Trojan War is longer than the period where they waited for the doom after the visions, which was like 12 years, right? Now, the Trojan War was like 20 years. But her prophecies started before the war started. She warned against Helen. She's like, don't go. I see you're going to Greece. Don't bring back Helen. They're like, eh? But of course, they don't listen to her. She even argues that they kill Paris when he's born. In some of the versions, not all the versions there's a bajillion versions of this Cassandra story. But she actually argues to kill Paris as an infant because like he's the one that's going to bring us all the harm on us. And yeah, well, whoops. She also warns about the Trojan horse. Like, how lazy are you, Trojans? Like, just check. Just to see if she's right. You don't have, just check the horse. How hard is that? They didn't want to check the horse. But that's why I say the curse was really on Troy and not just on Cassandra. In one version, she actually like takes an axe and a torch and is like, if you aren't going to check, I'm going to check. And they stop her. Damn it. She even predicted Aeneas's escape from Troy, predicted that Aeneas would escape and found Rome, which of course isn't what happened. That is a version of the myth, but yeah, she also predicted the Odyssey. She predicted that Odysseus would have this happen to him. She also predicted her own death if she went back to Greece with Agamemnon. Agamemnon took her as a slave, a concubine, basically. She predicted his death and hers, and that happened. Yeah. So this is rough because, yeah, it's a curse to be given knowledge of the future and no one will listen to you. But we've already gone over how it's awful even when they do listen to you. Just having knowledge of the future is bad regardless. But yeah, this does sound worse, a lot worse. Even in real world fiction and myths, prophecy is a curse. The gift of prophecy is not a gift at all. In a lot of cases, they read almost like a sacrificial victim. Like the prophet is the person born with this knowledge that is horrible for them to live with, but everyone else can benefit from it. So they are like, we sacrifice this person's life. They have to live a horrible life because they're burdened with this, but we can all benefit from it if we listen to them. In Cassandra's case, they don't. So it's kind of like their whole life is dedicated to others because they suffer, but if people listen to their prophecies, then humanity, or at least this city, the civilization can come out ahead. So with Daenys, we have like opposites or inversions of the Cassandra trope. And they did listen to her, right? They listened to her when it was most important, although only her family. So you still kind of have, it's still kind of the same trope because no one else listened to her. Although, if we go back to Nina's theory, Aenar didn't tell anybody else. That's part of why they did no one else listen. They didn't even hear. It wasn't that they weren't listening. They didn't even know what to listen to. But yeah, as we've said throughout this episode, it's entirely possible Daenys led kind of a tormented life. So yeah, living post-Doom would put a damper on everything, even besides the prophecies. In one version of the Cassandra myth, she and one of her brothers are left overnight in the Temple of Apollo. And that's kind of how they get their powers, or she gets her powers. They're found in the morning with snakes licking their ears. And snakes are associated with knowledge in Greek mythology. And for our purposes, it's really just kind of a step to go from snakes to dragons, right? It's not too far of a leap there. Cassandra does go mad in some versions of the story. The curse becomes too much to bear over time. She sees her own death coming, which is something we should consider. Targaryen madness and unwanted dreams, right? What if you're dreaming of your own death? What if Daenys keeps dreaming of her own death? What a horrible thing to see. Like, she doesn't know when it's coming. Like, if she knew it was 20 years in the future, then okay, well, that's not so bad. It still would be kind of bad, but at least you know you're not going to die soon. But like, if you don't know, if it's just one of these days I'm going to die, and you're like, well, I mean, welcome to the rest of us. But if she knows the exact manner of it and has some sense of it being soon, that's terrible. Now, here's a description that's a little off topic, but just hilarious. I couldn't resist. It's a description of Cassandra from a chronicler. This just about killed me. Quote.
Shortish, round-faced, white, mannish figure, good nose, good eyes, dark pupils, blondish, curly, good neck, bulky breasts, small feet, calm, noble, priestly, an accurate prophet foreseeing everything, practicing hard, virgin.
How do you just sneak that in there? First of all, those descriptions are crazy. Bulky breasts, just good neck. I mean, this is weird. But then just an accurate prophet foreseeing everything. Just throw that in there. Like, wait, that seems like the only thing that matters. Like, but virgin's in there, right? That actually is kind of an important detail. So this was from John Malalas. He was a Syrian living in Antioch under the Byzantines. He lived to be 87, actually. He died in 578 AD. So John Malalas is really important because he's the oldest surviving example of a guy who wrote history for common people, for monks, rather than the nobility. And this simple style and its aim, the fact that it was aimed at a wide variety of people, is why it survived. It was copied a lot. It was effective because of its simple style. A lot of people could understand it, and that's why it propagated. Kind of the opposite of signs and portents. Signs and portents was not meant for the common population. It was not meant to be widespread. And like the Book of Lost Books, Malalas cites a ton of sources in his book. He has because he's not a contemporary of Cassandra, like the Trojan War would have been almost 2,000 years, maybe more like 1,800 before he was born. And yeah, the Trojan War did happen, y'all. It used to be thought to be a myth, but no, we have in the modern world, semi-modern world, we've discovered enough archaeology to be sure that something like the Trojan War happened. Obviously not with all the specific details that were given. So yeah, Malalas in his book, he cites sources that we don't have. And so that's a perfect example of that concept of, well, he's citing authors that those books don't exist anymore. So we know those books existed. We just don't have anything about them other than these citations. Yeah, so that virgin part's kind of important because Cassandra's almost never married. In any of the myths, she's just, even though she's the most beautiful of Priam and Hecuba's daughters, she's kept separate like that. They don't arrange a husband for her. But you can't really be a virgin if she was sleeping with Apollo, right? That part doesn't exactly fit. You can't say sex with gods doesn't count, because of course it does, right? Why would that not count? Anyway, that's our little foray into the real world Cassandra and the Cassandra trope, which is, you will hear that thrown around here and there. Time for our quote of the week. Here's a passage that, when I read it, it immediately jumped out to me as the space version of a certain castle in Westeros that you will know immediately. You will grasp, certainly, as I read this, you will know exactly what castle I'm talking about. Here we go. Carved into Io's highest mountain, the 18-kilometer high Buosal, Sungrave is a city of black stone obelisks and spires that rides the shoulders of the mountain range. Centuries ago, after the use of Lovelock engines was deemed inefficient for Io, great mirrored lasers carved much of the mountain and part of its attending 540-kilometer-long range into a city of jagged towers. The builders followed the draconic predilections of their great progenitor, Akari, bringing creatures of childhood fables and ancient campfire stories to life in the stone. A necropolis of animalistic spires flecked with topaz, zircon, and a myriad nilosilicate rocks looms above us, blocking the sky like the petrified remains of a great dragon host. They perch rank upon rank along the Buosal's crest, some of them encompassing whole peaks, legs straddling frosted valleys, their wide wings buttressing their great heights as they crane their stone necks up as if to drink the gases of marbled Jupiter. Duroglass windows glitter with internal light like scales. And deeper, in the heart of the mountain, where long ago red drill crews dug out the interior, lies the city itself. That's from Iron Gold, Book 4 of Red Rising by Pierce Brown. That's my favorite series of the last 10 years that I've read. So you got to go back to The Expanse to find a series that I enjoyed as much as Red Rising. And obviously, this is Space Dragonstone, that description. I mean, that is space, mirrored lasers carving the mountain into dragons is very much like the Valyrian sorcerers carving gargoyles and dragons into the black fused stone of Dragonstone. Very cool. Carving directly into the mountain, which is also what Dragonstone has done. Also, you can see the influence here Red Rising has a lot of little nods to Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire. Even the name here is maybe is a nod. Sungrave is the city, and Kingsgrave is in A Song of Ice and Fire as well. Red Rising also has a deep grave, which is a mobile undersea prison for the worst of humanity. So that's kind of cool. Anyway, I hope I've inspired you to pick up Red Rising. Maybe we'll do some coverage of it at some later date if enough of y'all read it. Let's talk about the death and legacy of Daenys the Dreamer. How she is viewed now and how her character might still pop up as relevant in the story now. We don't know how she died. We don't know how long she lived, but it would have been a big deal no matter when it happened, given the status she probably had within the family as the one who saved them all. It's also kind of important whether she outlived her husband or not. Like, if she outlived her husband, then she would be like a regent advisory figure to her own children ruling Dragonstone. If she died before him, then that just didn't happen, and she wouldn't have seen her children ruling, and that's a little bit less interesting of a possibility. And if she was Balerion's rider, then that's a big deal, because Balerion needs a new rider, and that would be a large opening, literally, for some Targaryen. And it wouldn't be Aegon yet, because the intervening years, there's just too much time. So someone would have ridden Balerion, at least one rider of Balerion between her and him, assuming it was even her that rode Balerion. Again, would she have seen any of it coming? Would she have seen her own death coming? Would she have seen Aegon? Would she have seen any of Balerion's future? Or seen maybe future riders of Balerion? That's another possible thing. Now, her other daughter, her unnamed other daughter, remember she had Aegon, Elena, and a third child who is unnamed. That daughter's descendant showed up at the Great Council of 101 making a claim. Now, there's no extra value to this child in terms of her heritage. She can't say, oh, I'm descended from Daenys the Dreamer. They're all descended from Daenys the Dreamer. So that's not a leg up for her. Or him. I think it was a him, actually, but in this case. But they certainly didn't get very far in the Great Council because they didn't even have their name mentioned. I choose to believe that Daenys is somewhat revered by the Targaryens, but they're they're kind of a spoiled family. They don't necessarily revere their ancestors. We don't see them overpraising Aegon the Conqueror that much. They don't have shrines to him. So I'm not sure that they do a whole lot of ancestor worship or they're all that grateful. Maybe they're
they don't seem to name a lot of people directly after her.
Yeah.
Right?
Good point.
They have Dana, they have Daenerys, but why are there no other Daenyses?
Great point. Yeah, maybe they don't really love that name. And there's no other Gaemons really either. Gaemon the Glorious. I mean, yeah. A lot of the Targaryen Dragonstone names weren't repeated. There's an Aelix and a Magon.
These are archaic, Yeah. They sound old. They sound like Gertrude and Ruth to us, Yeah,
maybe that's it. They're just these names have fallen out of fashion, They were we need new names for a new era. Something that Hot D pushed conceptually that I find fitting for the books is the notion that the Targaryens were very pro-dreamers and visionaries because they owed their existence to Daenys. Which is why they're maybe more open to the Song of Ice and Fire, why Aegon took that seriously, and why the dagger was made and all that. We've talked about Aerys the First and Rhaegar and these other characters who later found books, and that put them, started them off on a new journey and maybe changed the way they viewed the world and their own family. They came along after Baelor the Blessed, so they may not have been able to read signs and portents, but they would still know of her. They would still be aware of her existence. It's not like the family forgot about her. So she likely instilled a healthy belief in many Targaryens in the utility, if not value, of listening or at least being aware of signs and portents. But that could have very mixed results. If we remember what Marwyn said and, the sword without a hilt thing. So we've seen George fill in this material after A Dance with Dragons, right? Most of what we know about Daenys and the details of the Targaryen flight from Dragonstone, of which there's still a lot more to be revealed. I think more of that backstory could come as a lot of these plotlines come to a head. I mean, Dany's going to learn more about her family history, whether through Sam, Marwyn, Tyrion, other people, who knows? George is really good at writing in backstory in creative ways and finding ways to sneak it in there. Not always in the POV it most relates to, right? Obviously, for example, Aemon figures out some very important prince that was promised stuff that he, right before his death, he tells it to Sam and straight up tells Sam to tell Dany. And then Sam tells some of this to Marwyn, and Marwyn's like, well, I'm going to go to Dany. So these conversations have yet to happen, but they seem likely to. Marwyn could meet Dany and argue with Tyrion about some of these things, kind of like how Tyrion argued with Haldon. They could cite sources during their arguments, and that would be a really good way for George to sneak some of this in there. It wouldn't even be sneaky. It'd be get it out there. Just drop it right in front of us. And again, Marwyn is not some naive guy. He's the one that said prophecy is dangerous. So he even though he's open to it, he's not naive about it. So that's very interesting too. And as the guy that wrote the Book of Lost Books, he's perhaps the foremost expert on this stuff. So I do think that some of this is really just beginning. That George didn't develop it earlier because he didn't have to, but now is the time where he needs to. And well, it's been another 12, 13 years since a lot of that stuff. So he's had a lot more time to think about it. And I imagine the Winds of Winter has already got some more detail in there. We just haven't seen it yet. Trivia. What book did Archmaester Marwyn write? As we said, it's possible he wrote other books, but we only know the one. The Book of Lost Books. Yes, that's right. That came up a few times this episode. Book of Lost Books is certainly a great concept for a book. I bet there's some real world books of lost books, you know? I mean, like we said, there's tons of examples of real world books that refer to other books as sources that don't exist anymore. So someone's probably compiled a lot of that. And someone out there, I bet someone listening right now has an answer for me. So let me know. Tell us where we can find examples of real life books of lost books. We mentioned a lot of episodes today that relate to this one, episodes that deal with prophecy, Targaryens, magic, dragons. Dragonstone is one such. We have an episode on the Doom of Valyria. We have an episode dedicated entirely to Balerion. We have an episode dedicated to the Century of Blood. We, of course, referred to the Ghost of Highheart, a different type of prophet, different type of prophecies. Summerhall, a big one. And later this year, we will have an episode called Who Knows, the Song of Ice and Fire, where we trace that particular prophecy through the Targaryen dynasty and talk about who else might know of it and who might learn of it. So that one isn't out yet, but by the time you hear this episode, maybe it is. Thanks to Nina for her great takes, a lot of great notes, and don't forget to check out goodqueenalley.tumblr.com. Thanks to Joey Townsend for our amazing music. Thanks to Michael Klarfeld for our video intro. You can see the map behind me as an example of Michael's great work, and you can buy a copy yourself or a file and then go have it printed yourself from klaradox.de. That's claradox.de. And until next time, on behalf of Ashea, I'm Aziz. You know what to do. Valar Rereadus.